Developing a great plan is not enough when bringing process change into your school. There has to be an intentional effort to inform all stakeholders involved or who will be affected by the new MTSS efforts. An effective communication plan should be developed that both informs stakeholders and cultivates support for consensus for why MTSS is important and how your school's new system will help students. Key elements that need to be communicated to stakeholders regarding MTSS are first the why. And within the why, it's the impact of how students will be affected by MTSS. First, talk about the academic opportunities, how students can improve their skills, how they'll be able to stay with their peers in grade levels, how they'll be able to avoid potential remedial courses down the road, how important early intervention is to avoid academic deficits and the accumulation of deficits over time. Also think about how will we communicate the expectations, the location that students are going to have interventions, the length of time that students will have interventions, and the routines that students will need to learn in order to participate in the interventions effectively. Also, think about the schedule changes and how scheduling options will impact where students will be and what students are available. And then, of course, what students available will influence the challenges and also where your staff's flexibility will be as far as what courses they can cover versus courses they already cover. And that, of course, brings us into staffing. Because staffing, they'll have to know what their expectations are. There may be many staff that are hesitant, and one of the first questions they're going to ask, am I going to have training for this? Am I going to have the time? Am I going to have a proper location? And what level of intervention do you want me to teach? You'll find that the Tier 3 interventions, which are the most intense, you'll have very few teachers on staff that feel comfortable teaching those interventions. So you have to discuss that with staff and think through those problems. The next thing is the resources. Like, how appropriate are some of the interventions that you have for the student deficiencies that you've identified? Age specificity is a big one, because you may have students that need decoding support and they're in 6th or 7th grade, but your decoding workbooks or your decoding interventions are focused for kids that are in 1st and 2nd grade, and the topic and subject matter may be demeaning to the students that are older, so you may have to find more age-appropriate decoding materials as an example. And then, of course, the preparation time. Some of the more intensive interventions require more time to be prepared to teach them. So how will you find time in the schedule for that to happen? For teachers that are teaching maybe more general Tier 2 interventions, is there maybe a point person that will be developing materials for everyone that's teaching that same strategy? Those are things to consider. The support, the instructional support. Are there going to be people available to push in and help teachers that are struggling with an intervention, or to problem solve if an intervention doesn't seem to be working quite as planned? And then lastly, the teaching assignments. What is the rationale of why you chose who to teach what? And also around the contractual obligations that may be barriers in some case. Make the case to the teachers how this is good for students and how the stringent intervention schedule may open up opportunities for other flexible times in the day. Those are all the things to discuss, not only with your staff, but also a good conversation to have with your district leadership as well, so you're all on the same page. As mentioned in lesson 1.5, principals report that they don't do enough to communicate to parents. So consider, how could you do a little bit better job maybe than what's been done in the past, reaching out to parents and giving them the rationale why MTSS will be good for their kids, the research and the evidence that supports that this will work if we do it correctly with your child. Be prepared to respond to questions, because parents will want to know, why can't they get this support in their normal class time? and talk about how they need their normal class time, which is the core, but they also need an opportunity to go deeper for additional support. And that if we don't have the additional support, we'll never catch up with the rest of the group. Parents want to know, why were they even placed in intervention? So you want to have some kind of explanation around the assessments that were used in the decision making. They'll want to know, were they singled out? And that's why the flooding model is actually a really preferred model, because if every student's getting some kind of intervention, there's less of a chance the student feels like they're being singled out. And then how long do they have to do it? Especially if they're losing out on a different elective to have to participate in intervention, you want to know what the time frame is and how frequently the assessments are given and progress monitored, so they can see when a student might be ready to leave that intervention. And they'll want to know what their expectations are as a parent. And then, of course, they're going to want to know how it's going to overall impact the student schedule. The 80% rule is a really key rule to remember in implementing and communicating with families and stakeholders, that don't expect, as we mentioned earlier in the earlier lesson about antibiotics, that if we take a little bit, we're going to get a little bit of effect. We're not really going to be able to see the effect of MTSS until we get to at least 80% implementation. In other words, if we only get into maybe the first few months of MTSS and then we try to assess whether it's working or not, it's going to be very difficult to be able to discern that from the data. But if we wait until we have 80% of the system in place and then we try to make that determination, is MTSS working, then we're more likely to have a realistic picture. Now, you're going to see students through the progress monitoring phase start to improve. But when we talk about improvement on a macro level, we're really talking about, are we improving student achievement? So it's beyond screening data or assessment data that we would do throughout the school year. We're talking about, as much as we can, our state assessments. So the considerations at the end of this lesson is a little bit more formal than we've had in the other lessons, because we don't want to leave anything to chance. Let's commit to paper a rollout plan that incorporates the elements of lesson 3.1. In other words, when, how, who, and how you're going to communicate these items needs to be more formally described. Look at the staff meeting times, professional development days, curriculum night, and PTA meetings that can support your communications. Because the more robust communication system you have, the less gotcha questions you're going to have on the back end. A good example is a principal that implements MTSS, identifies students that need intervention, and then changes their schedules to have those interventions without informing parents or giving them context. You could expect to have quite a few phone calls about why their schedules were changed. And if you only communicate to the students, they're not going to be able to really articulate most of what you've said to them to parents. So you want to have a more formal structure. So definitely take time and really sketch this out as a team and develop it and develop some consensus around it. And that, of course, will also improve the knowledge with staff about the system and the intentionality. So when they're out in the community and they're asked, hey, why are we doing these interventions, they'll be able to communicate the same message that you wish them to communicate.